All right, so welcome everyone to Pillars of Peace's webinar on how to support a survivor. This workshop is one that we designed really specifically for community members. Um, there's a lot of training and a lot of information that you can get if you work in this field or if you want to become a more serious volunteer with not just our organization, other places as well, working directly with survivors. But this webinar is really focused on the kind of basic information and approaches that you would need to know in order to be really helpful to somebody in your life or in your community who might be dealing with abuse. And you'll notice that a lot of the examples that we talk about today deal with intimate partner violence because that's a really large portion of what we deal with, but the same principles apply to all different forms of gender-based violence that we also deal with at Pillars of Peace, such as human trafficking, sexual assault, forced marriage, and FGM or FGC, female genital mutilation or female genital cutting, depending on the preferred term for that person. So without further ado, let's get started and head into the topic a little bit. So first, an introduction to Pillars of Peace. If you're not familiar with us, this is part of our sort of vision and mission statement that we are dedicated to creating culturally and linguistically conscious, trauma-informed communities of care by, for, and among survivors of domestic and gender-based violence. And while we welcome survivors of all faiths and communities, we are especially dedicated to filling a gap in services for survivors from Muslim communities. We understand that survivors from Muslim communities face specific, multifaceted barriers to accessing services regardless of their personal relationship with their heritage, faith, or community. So if you have any more questions about who we are, what we do, if we can be helpful to someone, to you or someone that you know, we really encourage you to reach out to our helpline or to our help email address, and those will be at a final slide at the end of the presentation. And you can also find them on our website, which is just pillarsofpeace.org, or you can visit our Instagram page, which currently is our most active social media page. So why are we covering this topic? We know that most survivors do not start off by going to an organization like ours or going to first responders or going to some kind of organized institution. Most survivors first disclose to a friend, family member, neighbor, or other community member. And sometimes it's not even that the survivor discloses it, but that this friend or community member witnesses the abuse taking place. And so we really want to empower more people in the community to be familiar with some of the key things that they can do to support survivors when they run into that situation. We also know that that person's response determines whether, where, when, and how the survivor will seek help. So I've heard everything from survivors from, it's my neighbor that not only gave me information on services, but actually helped me get, accompanied me to that center so that I could get there, or they offered me childcare so that I could get to that appointment. To the first person that I disclosed to really was dismissive or blamed me. And then, it took another several months or several years or multiple incidents before that person actually reached out again. So the more we as a community work to support survivors and address abuse, the healthier our whole community will be. And it's also important to note that the more that we are all empowered as a community to respond to different types of abuse and different sort of stages of abuse, that survivors may also be able to access help sooner, or they may be able to get support sooner in such a way that they don't have to deal with the most severe forms of abuse. That's not always going to be the case, but we want to make sure that people are not in a situation where they really are have to get to the most desperate, most difficult stage before the people around them really believe that this is abuse and that that person needs help or that they should get involved. So this is a question for all of you here. I'd like to know, what are you hoping to learn tonight? You can type it in the chat if that's what's most comfortable to you, or you can unmute yourself, or if you need me to unmute you, then you can just raise your hand and I will unmute you so that you can share. But I'd really like to hear if there's anything specific that you're hoping to get out of tonight's webinar, because you may have already realized that this is a really large topic and we are only allowing about 90 minutes, and really I'm trying to make sure that the last 30 minutes are just for questions. So I'd like to be able to focus on what is most important to you during this time.
I can share something, because I don't want to type too much. But basically, I'm a social worker at the Doors Legal Services Center, and we work with a lot of clients that have gone through FGM or any kind of gender-based violence. And I'm pretty much here to learn how to support this community, because I don't know too much about it. So yeah.
Oh, thank you so much. You're very, very welcome. I hope this will be a good intro to you, because it really is designed to be fairly general. And, I hope also that you'll feel like you can reach out to us if you have more specific questions, either as we finish the webinar today or afterward. Does anyone else have anything that they particularly like to get out of tonight's webinar, or even if you just want to share a reason why this was interesting to you? We're very cognizant of the fact that there are various serious things going on that are at the forefront of most people's minds right now. So we really appreciate those of you for taking the time to join us this evening. Okay, I'm going to move on, but I hope that you will share questions as they come up. And I also want to note that at the end of the presentation, I've designed several sort of hypothetical scenarios for us to discuss, but I will only use those if we don't have your own questions or scenarios to talk about first. Okay, so this is what we're hoping to cover today. And like I said, it's a pretty broad area, so it's not necessarily that we're going to go super deep, but we are going to focus on things that are practical and useful enough that we're not just that I hope everyone will leave today feeling like they are a little bit better equipped to deal with abuse when it comes up in their community, and to deal with how they can support survivors in their community from different positions. So the first piece is just talking about resources for survivors and support persons. And we are going to focus on the New York City area because that's where we're based and that's what we're most familiar with. But I'll also share some kind of general principles and resources that go beyond that. The next piece is about how to take a trauma-informed, strengths-based, and judgment-free approach, and why that is so important when you are trying to support survivors. And then the last two topics that we're going to cover are talking about how to center and support survivors, even when the survivor might not be the person that you are interacting with the most closely, or you might not have a relationship with them. So the first thing we talk about is allyship and how to support survivors in the community. There are a lot of things that we can do to support survivors, even when there's no specific survivor in our lives that we are aware of. There's a lot that we can do to make our community a safer place for survivors. And then the last piece is about addressing abuse. We very often hear from survivors that there are ways other people in their lives dealt with the person causing harm that really complicated things and made things more difficult for them. And then we also hear from survivors who tell us ways that maybe the family of the person causing harm actually was a support to the survivor and helped make things a little bit easier for them and help them stay a little bit safer along the way. And so that last piece is for us to talk about what happens when your relationship is with the person causing harm. How can you still be helpful to the survivor in a way that prioritizes their safety and also prioritizes your safety, without trying to do too much, without trying to intervene in ways that are either going to be unhelpful or that go beyond your own abilities and expertise. So just before uh, this seminar, I emailed everyone who had registered a copy of our survivor resource handout. But if you have not received one and you would like to get one, you can either email that general help email, or you can email me directly at jessamy@pillarsofpeace.org, and I will share that resource handout with you. I'm going to go over some kind of general areas and then I'll show you the handout, but we're not going to go over it in extreme detail. So the first thing that I want you to remember is that if you get this handout, try to just keep it handy, keep it somewhere that you can refer back to it fairly easily. You don't need to memorize everything, and that may not even be helpful because sometimes resources and programs change anyway. The second thing that is really, really important is that it's not just about knowing what resources are out there. It is really helpful if there's anything that you can do to help the survivor navigate those systems. It can be incredibly overwhelming, particularly for survivors who do end up engaging with the criminal justice system or first responders. They can go from being very isolated and under the control of the abuser and not having much interaction beyond the immediate family to suddenly having to navigate the court system, the child protective system, the financial issues, immigration, all kinds of different things. And so anything that you can do to lighten that survivor's load can be really helpful. And it doesn't have to be explicitly about making them safer. It can just be something like I mentioned earlier, helping that person access childcare or accompanying them. Or one of the resources that we're going to talk about is the Safe Horizon hotline for shelter. And calling the shelter hotline can be something that's very overwhelming for survivors. And they have to make that call by themselves. They can't have somebody speak on their behalf. So if you are somebody who can sit with them while they make especially that initial call, and help them just to feel like they're not alone in dealing with that, that can be a huge help. Also, when you're talking about somebody who would benefit from culturally sensitive resources, look for those. If the person that you're trying to help lives outside of New York City, try to look for resources that are local to them. This is not just because it's going to be easier for them to get to that building or that office. It's also because laws and programs and protocols for dealing with different forms of abuse vary significantly, not only from state to state, but from county to county and oftentimes even city to city. So being able to access resources that are local to the survivor ensures that they're not getting information that is not going to be applicable to where they live. At the same time, it's really important to be aware of limitations. One of the really unfortunate realities of this this field in general, and in the US and New York City in particular, we have a lot of resources that maybe don't exist in some other places, but as a rule, organizations that are dealing with gender-based violence and that are serving vulnerable communities tend to be very underfunded and often understaffed. And so it's not uncommon that the person who is trying to assist the survivor when they call might be assisting many, many other people at the same time. And while it is absolutely that person and that organization's job to provide a high quality of care to the survivor, in realistic terms, sometimes it can be very helpful if you're able to help the survivor do things like make follow-up phone calls or follow-up emails, because it's not unusual at some of these organizations, and I can say this as an advocate, a lot of times when I'm working with a survivor, even though I now work as primarily a therapist, I'm still sometimes doing case management and advocacy work. And oftentimes, a lot of what I'm doing is just reminding other organizations and other service providers that the survivor I'm working with still needs a response from them on something, or still has a need that, or there's a service that they're eligible for and that that organization is responsible for providing. So understand that connecting a survivor to a resource doesn't always mean that it's sort of home free and that person, that they're just going to be well taken care of from that point on. They're still going to need a lot of support, and whatever you can help them with is going to really make a big difference. And this last thing that I want to say is to respect the survivor's pace. I mentioned earlier that it can be very overwhelming when a survivor um, first discloses or first comes into contact with systems. And so it might be that they're just not ready to engage with different types of services or different types of programs. While sometimes there are limitations on when somebody can access a certain type of help, it in a lot of cases, it's really just not meaningful unless that survivor is ready for that particular service. So don't necessarily inundate with them with information. Ask them if they'd like to hear information from you, if they would like to hear about resources, and let them tell you if that's something that they're ready to hear or they're not ready to hear, or if they were ready to hear the information, but maybe they're not yet ready to contact the organization. Respect their pace, but just show that you are there to help them whenever they are ready to take that next step. So again, after we review the sort of general overview, I'm going to show you what the handout looks like that you're all going to get. But this is some of the key resources in New York City. So obviously, I work for Pillars of Peace, so I'm going to mention Pillars of Peace, that we provide remote counseling to New York State residents only right now. That's a licensing restriction, but we also provide case management to people in the New York City metropolitan area. We provide community education and empowerment workshops like this one. And in general, let's say that there's somebody in your life who is dealing with abuse, but that person's not ready to reach out yet. You should also feel free to reach out to us if you have questions about how you might be able to support that person. The next really key resource in New York City are the family justice centers. There is one in every borough. They're walk-in centers, and they have resources in almost every category. There are domestic violence liaison police officers if somebody wants to make a police report or they just need to look up past reports for whatever reason, but they don't feel comfortable going to their local precinct. That's something that they can do at the Family Justice Center. There is also case managers from a variety of different service providers at the Family Justice Centers. There are legal services, immigration, family law, and um, and even usually they're sharing some space as well with the DV bureaus for each borough. So if the person already has a criminal case or they might like to pursue one, it's often easy for them to access that assistance there as well. There's usually access to a small food pantry, clothing closet. Um, Usually there's transportation assistance provided, and there are many, many more things that can usually be accomplished at the Family Justice Center. So if somebody is able to go in person, this is a great resource to them. And also since the pandemic, I believe that the ability to access services and make appointments from by phone has been expanded. So you can also look up the Family Justice Center for that person's borough and access assistance that way. Most of the time, they should be going to the Family Justice Center for the borough that they live in. It's also going to be easier for them to get there. But when we're talking about getting legal advice, sometimes, or pursuing an order of protection, which is a document that makes it a crime for the person causing harm to contact them, or in some cases, if they're living in the home, they can also be barred from staying in the home. That sometimes will depend on the borough where the abuse happened or where the crime happened. And so in that case, they might need to go to a different center, or they might just need to speak with attorneys at a different center. The next big thing is about shelter. There is one central resource for accessing DV shelters, and this applies also to human trafficking shelters throughout the entire city. So if you call the Safe Horizon DV hotline, and the number is on our handout, this is a 24-hour hotline, and that the staff at Safe Horizon are updated regularly with openings in shelters across the city. So while if you have the contact for a specific shelter, it can be helpful to contact them sometimes, particularly if there's a reason why you're interested in that shelter, that it has certain specific resources that you need. That can be helpful, but this hotline is really how you can find out where the openings are for the whole city. Now, the first time that the survivor calls the hotline, they have to provide a lot of information. It's basically a full intake describing the type of abuse that's been happening, the most recent incident, what might be the most severe incidents that have happened. And they also will need to describe like where they currently live, where the person causing harm lives, and their family, in order for them to determine what would be a safe place for them to relocate to. Once they provide all that information on the first phone call, if there's no shelter space available at that time, or they're not able to move into shelter at that time, they can keep calling back, and they don't have to do that whole long intake again. They can just call back and say, give their information and say that they're still looking for a shelter space for whatever their family size is. So oftentimes for survivors, it's that first call that is really overwhelming, and they have to make it themselves. They do use language line interpreters in order to speak in a variety of different languages, but let's say you want to support somebody by interpreting for them, you would not be allowed to interpret for that person. It has to go through that language line interpreter, and it has to be that survivor themselves calling the hotline. Another kind of important thing to keep in mind is that what they're always looking for is that the DV shelters are for people who are unsafe where they're currently staying. and that they need shelter in order to be safe from the person causing harm. Sometimes people call the hotline, and even though that is the situation for them, that they are unsafe where they're at their home or they're unsafe where they're staying currently, they may emphasize the problem differently. Like I've worked with people who would say, I need an apartment or I need a house. And that doesn't, I hope that sometimes the intake workers are getting to be a little bit more understanding and sensitive, that people don't always express things the same way. But if you are working, if you are trying to support a survivor, you can help them as well to understand that um, the person on the other end of the line is going to be looking for um, an understanding of their situation and why it's not safe for them to be at home. So, for example, that, well, okay, now I'm currently living with my sister and her kids and her family, but there really isn't space for me here. And the reason that I'm here in this overcrowded shelter is because I left the home where I was facing abuse. Things like that. It's really important to show the connection between the abuse and the harm and the reason why that person is seeking shelter. Otherwise, they can get diverted to, oh, this person just needs regular shelter or family or homeless shelter. And you really want to make sure that it's clear that they need DV shelter, they need that additional protection, they need to be in a confidential location, and they need the services that are available to DV survivors in DV shelters. So when you call the hotline, there's no guarantee that there will be a bed or a space available in that particular family size. If the survivor really needs to get out of where they are immediately, they can go physically to Path Nova, and it's basically the same address as Path or the intake for family shelter, the family shelter system in New York City. And what they do is that they disclose that they are a survivor of domestic violence and that they are seeking safety in shelter. And that should have them processed in a way that identifies them as a DV survivor and that either places them in a DV shelter, or if there's no availability in a DV shelter, it places them in, it provides a placement that still has those additional protections of confidentiality and considerations for the safe location there as well. And so the address for that is also in our handout. I also wanted to mention the cyber abuse task force because this cyber abuse in the different forms is something that many, many people are facing now. And this is there's a huge repository of information and resources there. It's also true that some of the family justice centers have, on a volunteer basis, some help with getting people's devices reviewed for malware and spyware and things like that. But if somebody is dealing with cyber abuse, it's a really good idea to just check out that resource, the website, and see, what particular help that person can access. And I finally want to mention that there's national hotlines. In addition to, there's a national DV hotline. There's also a national human trafficking hotline. And there's also an organization called Pathways to Safety International. This is specifically for US citizens and US permanent residents who are facing a form of harm abroad. So if the person is, let's say somebody's brought on a vacation with their family and then they find out that their family is planning to just marry them off to someone and without their consent, they could contact this organization for help getting basically evacuated out of the country through the embassy system and connected with services back in the US. It also works if the person is abroad with a person causing harm and then they face abuse from that person over there, that the home country doesn't have the protections that they need. They can use that status as a US citizen or a US resident for help getting away from that person by returning to the US. It's a sort of specific resource and specific organization, but for people who are in that situation, it can be very useful. So I want to pause here and show you the resource handout. And while I'm doing that, does anyone have any questions on what I've brought up so far? Any comments, concerns, reactions of any kind? Okay, so here's just a sneak peek at that resource page that we provided via email, and that I can also send to you if you did not get it, if you weren't able to register. So this has it has our helpline, which is not 24 hours currently. This is during business hours, Monday through Friday, that we respond to it. But you can also leave a voicemail if it's not during business hours, and we'll get back to you within the next 2 business days. We provide services in English, Arabic, Bangla, French, and Urdu. This is the phone number for that 24/7 hotline, address for Path Nova. I also listed on here the resource for Day One NYC, because they work specifically with minors and young adults. And that's very important because sometimes the laws are a little bit different with them. And there's also emails and website for the Cyber Abuse Task Force, and addresses and phone numbers for all the New York City Family Justice Centers. And we have just sort of general guidelines here. This is some of what we're going to go over in the rest of the presentation, but it's a little bit of a reminder to you of how to be supportive to the survivor, alongside of giving them information and resources. Oh, thank you for joining us, Mahmoud. And hopefully I'll see you again soon at some other presentation. Okay,
Yes,
so
thank you.
so let me resume the presentation here. So I did want to have take a moment to talk about what if the survivor is outside of New York City. It's very common for us to get calls from people who are, New York City is a commuter hub, so there's lots of people who are in New York City for work, but maybe they live in Connecticut or New Jersey, or they used to live in New York, but now they live in these kind of surrounding areas. So it's not that you can't reach out to Pillars of Peace or New York City services, especially for some of these nearby locations, but very often there are at least a few ways that their situation might be different and that they might need to access resources closer to them. So if you're talking to a survivor in general, it's helpful to know not only where the survivor lives now, but where the abuse happened and where the survivor may need or want to escape. So sometimes maybe the survivor is in a completely different part of the country, but their family or their support system is in New York City. For example, sometimes organizations can even assist after the relocation or with the relocation itself, depending on the situation. So it's important to have an idea not only of where the survivor is, where the abuse happened, but also where they may need to go. Or let's say you first come across the survivor in one place, but the abuse happened somewhere else. There may still be things that they need to do dealing with that previous location, particularly if they have children and there's questions about custody laws. So obviously make use of national hotlines in Google to turn up resources in different areas, but obviously avoid running searches on devices an abuser can access. So use your own devices if that's something that the abuser doesn't, or the person causing harm doesn't have access to. We're not the only ones that do this, but at Pillars, we do have a sort of internal directory that we keep updating. It's not comprehensive, but we are particularly keeping track of organizations and resources that are sensitive to Muslim populations and associated diasporas. So it's possible that if you call us saying that you know somebody or you yourself are dealing with abuse in a different state or a different part of the country, we may have a couple of suggestions already for where you could start. And also, if you're dealing with a rural area or a suburb, you can always try looking at the nearby city where more resources might be concentrated, or you can do a search by county, which is often how funding and programs are divided outside of big cities. It's often, I live in New Jersey, so there's a lot of things that are like, this is the Essex County Women's Center, or this is the Union County services for a particular legal services might be divided by county. So you can try searching that way instead of using city or town names, and sometimes that will be more helpful. And as I mentioned before, many of these organizations, particularly as you get into more rural areas, are underfunded and understaffed. So if you can help the survivor to make follow-up phone calls, to be kind of, persistent about calling, that can be very helpful, because sometimes they just simply don't have the capacity to keep up with the level of need that they are dealing with. And it's something that is really unfair for survivors to have to deal with. But as long as that is the funding situation, nationally and locally, everything that we as community members can do to help people deal with it is going to be very helpful. Okay, so now we're going to talk more about the approach, and this is a big deal. We don't want people to worry about saying or doing the perfect thing to the point that you don't do anything or you don't say anything. It's always better to speak up when there's something that you're concerned about than to simply, be silent or passive. But there are things that we hear from survivors made them feel discouraged or made them feel um, less confident about reaching out for help, or even prevented them from getting to that next stage of reaching out for resources. I'm wondering if anybody here can think of some common supportive or seemingly, well-intended responses that could end up backfiring and alienating or discouraging the survivor. So I'll give one example and then sort of move on to the next slide. But if there's something that you think about, feel free to chime in later, type or unmute yourself. Something that seems very natural to a lot of people is that if the survivor says, you know what, I've had enough, I'm gonna leave, I'm gonna call the shelter, I'm gonna file a police report, whatever the person says that they're going to do, and the supportive friend or community member says to them, oh, you're doing the right thing, that's absolutely what you should do, good for you, I'm so proud of you. sometimes these kind of responses can actually backfire because while in that moment that you're talking to the survivor, they may feel that they're ready to take that step or that step is going to work well for them, it's possible that their situation could change very quickly and that they might decide not to do that thing. And then sometimes they feel shame that they did not do the thing they said they were going to do. And then that can discourage that person from reaching out to you again. So a lot of times, what we want to emphasize in supporting survivors is not telling them that a particular course of action is the right thing to do or the best thing to do, but simply encouraging them to be able to make decisions for themselves. So, um, making sure that they have all the information that they need, making sure that they know you can come to them, whatever the next step is, whatever they decide to do. And if they're talking about taking some kind of step, maybe showing that you're there to help brainstorm with them about how to make that happen, practically and logistically, but kind of moving away from making these sort of positive or negative judgments about what they're deciding to do. It's really, really important that we recognize the survivor's strengths. So, at the same time that it's true being in an abusive situation, whether we're talking about an abusive partner or an abusive family, parent or guardian, um, or somebody who's being trafficked, it's true that that person is conditioned over time to doubt their own strengths, to doubt their own ability to make decisions. It's also true that while they are navigating that situation, they are constantly looking out for their own survival and their own safety and the safety and survival often of any dependents or children, people that they're taking care of. And so we want to really make sure that we recognize those strengths, and that we don't kind of perpetuate the same problem that they're dealing with the abuser, where we kind of install ourselves as the next person to tell them what's right and what's wrong and what's best for them. We want to really lift up what that person's doing. So a way that we can do this without making those value statements that I mentioned earlier is that if they're telling us about something that happened, we can just notice and emphasize what they were doing in that moment to take care of themselves. Like we might say, "Oh wow, that sounds like it was really scary. It, you were really thinking quickly on your feet in order to um, move your children into the other room." Or um, I can see how difficult it was to reach out to me or to the neighbor. And I'm really impressed that you were able to do that in such a difficult situation. So you see how you can be really genuine about how difficult the things are that they're doing and that you are applauding that, but you're not saying to them like something that implies that you would judge them for doing something differently the next time or in a different situation. So I think that kind of covers that piece of support. Don't evaluate or judge. We also want to stay trauma informed. So that means that we are not requiring the survivor to repeat lots of in specific details of the abuse that happened. Sometimes that's what people want to do. So if that's the case, that's a little bit different. But you don't want to put them in a situation where you are kind of asking for more details out of your own curiosity or because you harbor some doubt about what it is that they're dealing with. That is re traumatizing to the person, and it's also just not necessary for you to support them. The other piece of being trauma informed is understanding some of what might be coming up for that person and some of their behavior. Um, This can be true even after or even especially after the person leaves that abusive situation. Um, when people are relearning how to take control of their lives and how to trust their own judgment and their own perceptions, they are often in a position where they need to kind of feel out their boundaries all over again. And sometimes that can look very messy from the outside. And something that is really commonly happens to survivors, unfortunately, is that people in their lives will see them going through this kind of difficult period of growing and relearning how to live life on their own without somebody controlling them. And because it looks a little messy, because they are maybe behaving in ways that seem strange to people who are not in their shoes, other people might say, oh, well, maybe they really needed that person to control them. Maybe they really were just, such a mess that this is what was necessary. So that's just one example, but in general, you want to understand that they may behave in ways that seem erratic to you. They may have they may underreact to some things and overreact to other things. And all of that is very likely a result of the trauma that they've experienced along with the abuse. It is definitely not a reason or a cause for it. That's not to say that if the person is behaving toward you in a way that is unsafe or simply unhealthy for you, that you should just, passively take it. But you can look out for your own well-being and safety with that person without making their behavior into a reason why they deserved to be abused or why they maybe don't deserve help. So I mentioned safety, and so I do want to talk about emergency services and risk. So obviously, as much as we want to emphasize centering the survivor and their needs, there are times when it will be necessary to call emergency response services, and even when you might not have consent from the survivor, or you might not have time to get the consent. So the first is that if the survivor or their child is in immediate danger, like this may be something where you're witnessing an event happening and it's unsafe for you to intervene, call emergency services, because at this point it's beyond your capabilities. And you, I do, as much as some survivors may be upset that other people called emergency services, I've equally heard from survivors who are upset that nobody called. Nobody called for help while this thing was going on. And I was just left alone to deal with it. Um, and the next thing is that, I'm a mandated reporter, so is everyone who works in these different survivor support organizations. But it's also true in general that if you, a community member, know that a child is witnessing abuse or experiencing it themselves, that we have a duty to protect that child. And while most survivors are doing everything that they can to help and protect their children, sometimes they are in a situation where they're not able to provide that protection. And it really is necessary to bring in supportive services in order to help them with that. When we're dealing with survivors and we need to call in, we need to make a report to protective services, we always do our best to advocate for that survivor and to make sure that it does not become something that is punitive toward the survivor. In fact, in New York State, it is illegal for the survivor to be punished for being a victim of domestic violence. But we also know that the reality is very variable when we're dealing with these institutions. So it's not a perfect solution, but one of what you can kind of do is try to continue to be a support for them as they're dealing with those institutions. Um, the last things that I wanted to touch on briefly, but we're not going to go in depth in them just because it would take too long, is that there is something called a lethality risk assessment that a lot of service providers use. And this is really just a list of different factors that make it more, that drive up the risk of a homicide in the case of domestic violence. And so when you know that there are a lot of these factors, and I can send a copy of this as well to the participant, to all of you via email. When you know that there are a lot of those factors present for a survivor, it's very, you want to take into consideration that their situation might be particularly dangerous, and that can be something you share with them. It doesn't mean that you're telling that to them to scare them, but sometimes hearing that those factors are associated with a higher risk is something that can help survivors to understand that they need to take their situation seriously, because usually the person causing harm and maybe other people in their lives are going to be telling them it's not that serious, you're being dramatic. The other thing that we're not going to go in depth on, but I hope that we can help provide a community training on soon, is what's known as non-fatal strangulation, or just choking, when somebody attempts to choke the survivor. This is something that it can be extremely dangerous. It's usually done repeatedly by any person causing harm who uses this, and you do not need a lot of force in order to cause some permanent damage. And the big thing that I think is important for community members to know is that when non-fatal strangulation occurs, there is a risk of delayed complications and delayed death, including stroke or clot forming in that area. There do not have to be any type of marks. So if you hear of somebody that you know saying that, oh, the abuser or the person causing harm, choked me, or they put their hands around my neck, or even just that they like lost consciousness, or they're confused about some gap in time during the incident, then it would be good to really encourage that person to seek medical care so that they can check whether any of these complications are happening before they are at risk of death. You may notice other signs, like that person having a very raspy voice, but it's whether you hear those signs or not is something that is important to be conscious of. And it can be important in general, if you know that a physical incident has happened, to encourage the survivor to seek medical care, and for them to share, particularly with the provider, that some type of choking event happened, because then the provider should be able to screen for these other complications that may happen. And the last thing is suicide risk. Again, we're not going to go in depth on how to do a suicide risk assessment with someone as a community member. That's a whole training on its own, but it is something that is important to be aware of with survivors of abuse as well. And so you want to be alert to things like them expressing hopelessness, or just showing signs of really serious depression, and ask them if they have had thoughts of suicide, and try to and encourage them to connect with either counseling or mental health services or emergency services, depending on the level of risk or the level of intensity that they're describing. So next is your safety. You should not confront the abuser violently or physically, or insert yourself into the power control dynamic the survivor is facing. And the reason not to do that is because not only because you might expose yourself to harm, or the abuser might, or the person causing harm might start focusing on you, but it's also because sometimes there can be an increased retaliation against the survivor later on. Take into account your role and position. If you're somebody that the person causing harm sees as an authority figure in their life, somebody that they respect, you may be able to have more influence over that person than somebody who is like their younger sibling or their student or somebody that they have power over. So if you have that level of authority and influence, use it, but um, don't like put yourself in harm's way in order to try to intervene in a way that could harm you or could actually make the situation worse for the survivor. And so I kind of overemphasize this by saying don't add violence to the situation or physically intervene unless you're somebody who has training and ability to do so. And when I'm talking about physical intervention, that would be something where you were blocking or de-escalating, and that you have the training to do that. It's always helpful to think of bystander intervention techniques. These can be really helpful for survivors because it's less likely to lead to a situation where the person causing harm says, oh, what's going on between you and that person? Why did that person feel like they could talk to me like that? Or why did that person seem so interested in what's going on with you? If you use that sort of distract or delay technique where you just either where you appear to maybe not be noticing what's going on, but bring one of the people out of the situation by saying, "Oh, hey, I need to talk to you right now," or I have something I want to show you." Whatever it is, if you can make it not about what's happening, that can be a really helpful way to de-escalate the situation, or at least just provide an opening for that survivor to get to safety. And, obviously, we mentioned emergency services, but it doesn't have to be just emergency services. Ask for help. Don't try to take everything all into yourself. And we also want to mention that it can happen that the person causing harm directs their aggression at you. And so if that happens, take it seriously, safety plan for yourself and adjust. Don't assume that because you're not the primary victim that this person will never do anything to you. Unfortunately, we have heard that sometimes uh, a person causing harm will direct violence at somebody else if they believe that person is threatening their power and control over the victim. We also want to talk about your emotional well-being and safety. So actively supporting somebody dealing with abuse is hard work. In order to be there for them, you also really need to take care of yourself. You need to make sure that this is not what's taking up your entire life, that you're getting time to replenish and focus on other things in your own life, your own relationships. If you have a particularly heavy experience with a survivor, try to give yourself time to rest after, or if you know it's coming up, rest before. And also don't take on the responsibility for the ultimate outcome. Your success is in providing the support. The survivor is still in the steering wheel. They need to be in the steering wheel in order for this not to be a replication of the abuser's narrative that they can't do things on their own. And so it's really important that you don't take on all the responsibility and that you think to yourself, after a particular interaction with the survivor, okay, what did I do? I provided the survivor with information. I helped the survivor to call this organization, and I know that now they're connected to an advocate there. I gave the survivor some time to think about other things. I helped them have a day where they didn't have to worry about their safety. Whatever is that you're doing, think about what you are immediately providing and less so about the outcome, because you do not have control over that. There are things that you can do to make the situation better, but you cannot determine what the outcome is. And if you put all of that on yourself, it's going to be very heavy and be hard for you to continue. So, right, I want to try to go quickly through these next topics so that there's time for questions. But I wanted to talk about allyship and indirect support. So many of us might never, even though we know that all of us probably know somebody dealing with abuse, we might never be in a position to directly support the survivor or directly intervene. But the way that we talk about abuse, the way that we talk about survivors, makes a big difference in our community. It sends signals to abusers and survivors about what is acceptable and normal in our society. And when we speak against abuse, against victim blaming, or against unhealthy relationship norms, we may inspire a survivor to ask for help. We may push a person causing harm to question their actions, or at least feel less emboldened to escalate, and ultimately make our community safer. There were some studies done on repeat serial rapists in college campuses, and what they found was that they exclusively studied men, and the majority of perpetrators are men, unfortunately, of these crimes. But the men who were committing these rapes really said a lot of things to the effect that they thought that this is how everyone was. Um, of course, this is what you would do. You obviously take advantage of others. And what is likely happening with some of these people is that when they express their really outrageous or misogynistic viewpoints, the people around them are not confronting or contradicting them. They are maybe passive or silent, and that person takes their silence as permission or as proof that other people agree with them. And so when we're just out in the community talking about abuse and violence and survivorship, it's really important that we do not passively sit back and allow people to say outrageous things that somehow the victim is to blame for the violence enacted upon them, because that usually does embolden the person causing harm to do more. Recently, we heard of, I attended a training where a survivor was talking about how she reached out for assistance from the police with her abuser, and the police in that instance basically told the abuser that they understood that um, you know women could just ruin your life with these type of accusations, and that they essentially told the uh, person causing harm that they had his back. And he escalated the abuse after that point, and he even expressly told the survivor that, like you saw, you don't if you try to ask for help, they're going to help me, not you. So we want to make sure that we are sending the signal to survivors and to abusers, like in our community, that we are not going to stand for abuse, and that we are going to support survivors. And that in and of itself can make the community safer for a survivor. We also should mention advocacy. I've mentioned before funding and differences in laws and policies. And so this is something that we can do too to help survivors, is to lobby and organize for better laws, better policies, better funding for services, access to housing, healthcare, education, childcare, things that make life easier for survivors and make them less vulnerable to abuse. So last topic is, what if your connection is not to the survivor, but to the person causing harm? Your actions can actually make a really huge difference to the survivor's safety and well-being. I've heard from survivors of intimate partner violence where their in-laws or the person causing harm's family were supportive of the survivor. Their experience is very different than somebody who the person causing harm family rallies around him and treats the survivor as the villain. So the first thing that anyone can do is to support the survivor's safety. And in general, you always want to center the survivor's needs and preferences. If you have communication with them, obviously listen and prioritize their preferences. But not everybody will have that access, and it might not be safe or reasonable for you to reach out to the survivor to find out how they would like you to support them. But there are some general principles that you can follow. First is just do not facilitate the person causing harm's access to the survivor of their children. If the person causing harm starts to talk about or fantasize about hurting them or causing them harm, you have a duty to warn them and call for help. And if you do not have access to call them, then you can reach out to, again, you can reach out to emergency services, you can reach out to police to say, look, this person just keeps talking about wanting to harm this person, and I don't know for sure if they're going to do it, but I'm concerned. Um, you also can use those bystander intervention techniques. This can be even more effective because you might be somebody that the person causing harm already knows and trusts. You want to use your relationship. As we said before, if you're friends with the person causing harm, if you're like a trusted older sibling, a parent, you may be able to enact some influence on that person. This may not be um, beyond really basic things like making sure that that person doesn't violate a protection order or doesn't um, keep harassing the survivor, but you can still use that relationship to reduce the amount of harm that person is acting on the survivor. You can also help others around the person causing harm to join you in supporting the survivor's safety. You could be that person influencing others in your friend group or your family to say, look, this stuff that our friend or a loved one is doing is not right. It's causing harm to somebody else, and it's probably not good for them either. We need to be thinking about how we can reduce their ability to cause harm to other people. And we need to make sure that we are not facilitating that person's access to the survivor. It's very, very common to hear from survivors that friends or family members of the person causing harm reported their location to the abuser, that they spread even rumors to the abuser, if perhaps that person is in a new relationship or merely the family member somebody thought that they were. It's very often friends and family members of the person causing harm who are escalating the situation. And so if you are a friend or family member of the person causing harm, you can do a lot by simply doing the opposite of that. At the same time, you should have realistic expectations. Yes, we know that the person causing harm undoubtedly has a trauma history. Undoubtedly, there are reasons why they have turned to abusive behavior that have to do with their own developmental experiences and problems. That said, while participating in therapy, substance abuse treatment, or other programs can be helpful for the person causing harm, it is not a guarantee that they will become a safe partner or parent. You can help that person to access the therapy or the treatment and encourage them to do so. But it doesn't mean that the second that they join that program or even once they finish it, that means they're great, they're good to go, and you should go encourage the survivor to reconcile with them. But it's not usually the case. You want to be somebody who is helping the person causing harm to address their problems and not to avoid consequences. A lot of times, people think that being compassionate toward the person causing harm means that you should convince the survivor not to press charges, that you should reduce the possibility of that person being arrested, you should reduce the possibility of that person losing their job because their criminal behavior has been reported. those things do not help the person causing harm because they insulate them from the consequences of their behavior and ultimately empower and enable them to cause further harm. So your role, if you are trying to help the person causing harm, is to hold them accountable within your capacity, which may be quite limited depending on what your relationship with them is, to support survivors' safety and not to normalize or validate dynamics of power and control. It's not to personally rehabilitate the person causing harm. This is, even if you were yourself a therapist, by the fact that you have a relationship with this person, you cannot be the one trying to get them to a place where they are no longer causing harm. And even a professional who is working with somebody who has a history of abusing others is not going to say, okay, you've done 6 months of therapy with me, you're now cleared to, and I know that you're not going to abuse anyone else. These are often lifetime patterns people have learned, and it's extremely difficult for them to change those behaviors. And um, it does. It is true that they may want to change them. They may be actively working on them, and it still may be very, very difficult for that person to become a safe partner. So, in any situation, we want to support that person to the extent that they are interested in getting help and services to access them, but we want to be realistic that just because they access services or treatment, it doesn't mean that they are immediately going to be a safe partner or even a safe parent. Again, it's important to look out for your own safety. So whenever you're in any type of heated situation, it's important to de-escalate and self-regulate. You want to make sure that you are not adding to the tension of any particular moment, or maybe you're just discussing things with the person causing harm. If you're finding that you're getting so agitated that it's not a sort of calm but difficult conversation that you're having together, it might be that this is not the right way for you to try to intervene or help that person. You always want to think about the role that you play in that person causing harm life, and that you are using your role in in an appropriate way to help reduce their ability to cause harm. So if you have influence over them, definitely use it, but don't um, try to do too much when you don't have that role of influence over them. Um, Take threats seriously. If that person starts to threaten you, no matter who you are in their life, it is very possible that they will act on that threat, and you should not be dismissive of it, and you should take it just as seriously as we are encouraging survivors to take the threats against them. And again, we want to say to get help. If you're talking to this person and they are talking about wanting to harm themselves or harm somebody else, it's a good idea to access emergency services and not to take it upon yourself to somehow prevent that person from taking more extreme steps. Okay, because we're nearly at 7 o'clock, I'm not going to go into the scenarios, um, but I just want to open up to any questions that you have in the group. And I also want to share our feedback form so that you can share with us what you found helpful, what wasn't helpful. We're in particular thinking of expanding this workshop into something that is in person, more interactive, and maybe takes place over multiple sessions. So your feedback will be really helpful in continuing to plan that and determine what will be most helpful to the community. All right, so I'll wait here for a bit for questions, and I can stop recording in case that is what is discouraging. some of you from sharing your question.